In the 1990s, during the era of wild capitalism, complete legal vacuum, and total gangster arbitrariness, the Russian police found themselves at the epicenter of chaos. The media and public opinion at the time mercilessly criticized law enforcement agencies for their powerlessness in the face of organized crime, for their venality, and for alleged widespread corruption. The same images flashed across the screens: a policeman with a dull look in his eyes, taking a bribe or protecting gangsters. However, in reality, things were not so clear-cut. Yes, there were corrupt officials, as in any system, but alongside them, there were still many true fighters in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. People who, despite their meager salaries, worked honestly, fighting on the streets, engaging in shootouts with heavily armed criminals, sometimes without proper equipment or support. Many of them died without even having time to start a family or get a place to live. Such heroes are rarely remembered. But it was thanks to their courage and integrity that lawlessness on the streets finally began to subside. This film is about such people. We will tell you about the Moscow criminal investigation officers, fighters who, without unnecessary noise, without medals and fanfare, were able to eliminate the backbone of one of the most bloodthirsty criminal groups of the 1990s, the Koptovskaya organized crime group, in just a year and a half. This gang was distinguished by its particular cruelty and ostentatious madness, as if straight out of a Quentin Tarantino film. Rockets, robberies, seizures, control of locations, extortion, kidnappings, murders, all accompanied by theatrical audacity and ostentatious coolness. They carried fake FSB and MVD IDs, committed crimes in uniform, and were not shy about demonstrating their power. Behind them stood a whole parallel hierarchy, a real criminal power structure that completely controlled the north of the capital. But at some point, the leaders of the Koptovskaya organized crime group lost their caution. They became so emboldened that they decided to openly challenge the system. They began to threaten and attack not businessmen, but law enforcement officers themselves. It was then that the Moscow Regional Department for Combating Organized Crime, ROB, was given carte blanche to act. The Koptovskaya organized crime group is notable for the fact that, unlike most other powerful criminal groups of the 1990s, this gang was almost never led by thieves-in-law or any other recognized criminal authorities. While the Solntsevskaya organized crime group had Mikhail, the Orkhovskaya had Sylvester, and the Taganskaya had Rospis, the Koptovskaya did not have such a prominent head. The structure of the organization was more like a closed clan, where power was distributed among several influential elders from the district, rather than concentrated in the hands of a single leader. This made the Koptovskaya organized crime group less vulnerable to law enforcement agencies. There was no single center that could be targeted to decapitate the entire system. This phenomenon is most likely explained by the criminal traditions characteristic of this particular district. The criminal roots of the Koptovskaya gang go back to the Soviet Union, to the 1960s, when the district was being built up with barracks and communal apartments. By the mid-1970s, a strong mafia network had formed there, controlling not only local markets, garage cooperatives, and industrial zones, but also the surrounding villages and settlements. This network was not based on the laws of the criminal hierarchy, but on family and street connections, on concepts forged in prisons and strict regime colonies. When mass construction of the district began in the 1970s and the demolition of old barracks, where the gangsters' hideouts, warehouses, and stashes were located, began, builders regularly stumbled upon caches buried in the foundations, with weapons, currency, jewelry, and black cash. These finds were sometimes not even reported to the police. They were simply disposed of or disappeared in an unknown direction, and the criminal world of the district continued to live on, adapting to the new conditions. The first serious attempt by the authorities to shake up Koptov's criminal structure came in 1980. The Olympics were to be held in the capital, and surprisingly, it was the Koptovsky district that found itself in the spotlight. The Olympic Village and many sports facilities were located there. It was critically important for the Soviet authorities to show exemplary order, especially in front of foreign guests. Then, on orders from above, powerful forces of the police, operatives, and KGB officers entered the district. Mass purges, detentions, expulsions of newcomers, preventive conversations, and control over every courtyard were carried out. Criminal activity declined sharply, and for a short time, the district literally breathed a sigh of relief. But as soon as the Olympics ended and control weakened, the Koptovskaya gang quickly returned to their places. The street kids who lived in doorways and cooperative garages came back to life. At that time, Koptev's criminal world was formed around two influential figures, a criminal named Victor, nicknamed Dovzina, and a former speculator nicknamed Patma. The former was a classic representative of the old school, having served time in prison camps, wielding considerable influence in criminal circles and recognized as the elder in the district. Patma, on the other hand, being a more business-minded individual, occupied the niche of illegal trade and shadow finance. Despite their different approaches, both enjoyed considerable authority. Dovzina in particular was sought out as an arbitrator to resolve disputes between entrepreneurs, gangsters, and even ordinary residents. He charged a fee for his services, but at the same time made decisions that no one dared to challenge. However, over time, both disappeared from the scene. Rumors spread throughout the district that Dovzina had been quietly and neatly eliminated, in a small circle, without unnecessary noise, possibly at the behest of those who were bothered by his authority. Patma simply vanished. Either he fled abroad or he also fell victim to the knife. After their disappearance, power over Koptev passed to the brothers Rifat and Mansour, known for their harsh manner of ruling. However, their reign was also short-lived. One of them died of a heroin overdose, and the other, according to rumors, was thrown out of a high-rise window. The case was ruled a suicide, but no one believed it. Other brothers, Alexander and Vasily Naumov, took their place. Alexander, nicknamed Naum, became the main force and hands of the gang. He was combative, quick-tempered, and ruthless, often participating in reprisals and showdowns himself. His younger brother Vasily gravitated toward money and business. He set up shadow schemes, protected car services, markets, shops, clubs, and later even invested in legal enterprises. Together, the brothers organized the Koptevskaya Organized Crime Group, which in the 1990s became one of the most brutal and unscrupulous gangs in Moscow. According to operational data, the gang's combat strength reached 50 active fighters, each of whom carried a firearm. The group had dozens of pistols, automatic weapons, grenades, and even one grenade launcher at its disposal. A distinctive feature of the Koptevskaya gang was its iron discipline. The rules were enforced more strictly than in the army. Disobedience was punished with a preventive measure, using a belt, brass knuckles, or simply disappearance. But their main feature was a complete lack of respect for outside authority. The Koptevites never bowed to thieves-in-law or other influential figures in the criminal world. Moreover, if any of the law-abiding tried to dictate their terms, they were simply eliminated. By the early 1990s, the Koptevskaya Organized Crime Group had subjugated virtually the entire north of Moscow. Their sphere of influence included cities such as Dolgoprudny, Lobnya, Zeleznodorozhny, as well as huge chunks of the northwestern administrative district of the capital. They controlled large warehouses, logistics centers, markets, and even the area around Sheremetyevo 1 and Sheremetyevo 2 airports. It is also known that for dirty work, especially contract killings, they regularly hired mercenaries from Krasnoyarsk, the so-called Krasnoyarsk Group. It was led by two men, Kong and Diplomat. It is noteworthy that the Krasnoyarsk militants, whom the Koptevskaya Organized Crime Group regularly brought in to carry out the dirtiest jobs, were transported to Moscow by plane, strictly unarmed, without firearms, since it was impossible to pass through security with them. That is why the main method of eliminating targets for these killers was strangulation. The method was quick, silent, and, most importantly, did not require weapons. It was this signature that often surfaced in criminal cases involving contract killings committed in the interests of the Koptevskaya gang. In essence, Krasnoyarsk became a talent pool for the gang. New people regularly arrived there, ready to do the bloodiest work for money. The methods used by the Koptevsky gang were particularly bold and aggressive. They did not act like, say, the Solntsevskaya gang. They did not seek compromises or negotiate, but simply destroyed their competitors head-on. Among other Moscow gangs, the Koptevsky gang earned the nickname Proletarian because they acted roughly, quickly, and without unnecessary sentiment. If they needed to take over a business, they did it quickly. A few visits, arson, threats to relatives, and the matter was settled. It was precisely because of this tough manner of doing business that the Koptevsky gang was respected by many regional organized crime groups, but at the same time inspired fear. In the event of a large-scale conflict or war over territory, Naum and his crew could count on support from several regions at once. Alliances with gangs from Ticino, Orakovo, Borisovo, and Lyaburtsi were cemented with both money and blood, often with the help of mutual orders to eliminate competitors. In addition, trusted delegations from Krasnoyarsk, St. Petersburg, and even Sochi could always arrive. In essence, the Koptovskaya organized crime group had its own criminal diplomacy, built through strong ties and the exchange of services. However, their streak of bad luck began in 1993. On November 6, the Regional Organized Crime Control Department, RUOP, decided to take targeted action against the growing lawlessness. There were too many cases, too many bodies, too many complaints from businessmen and residents who were being terrorized by the Koptovskaya gang. Operatives went out on a tip-off, planning to quickly arrest several key members of the group. But things did not go according to plan. Right on the street, in broad daylight, their official vehicles came under fire. The Koptevsky youths, without losing their composure, began firing at the police with everything they had at hand, from automatic weapons to hunting rifles. According to eyewitnesses, it all looked like a scene from a Hollywood action movie or a shootout between a Colombian drug cartel and the police. A real battle broke out on a Moscow street, with explosions, screams, gunfire, and panic. As a result of this sudden attack, 5 RUBOP officers suffered serious gunshot wounds, and the rest had to retreat. The unit was simply not prepared for such fierce resistance. This became a high-profile scandal, which ended up in classified reports and caused a serious stir in the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The surprise and shock with which the leadership of the Ministry of Internal Affairs reacted to this attack quickly gave way to determination. The top brass understood that the situation needed to be brought under control urgently, otherwise crime would soon completely drive the security forces off the streets. As a result, the Koptovskaya organized crime group was given an unofficial black mark by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. This meant only one thing: by any means necessary, even without regard for evidence, the gang had to be eliminated. A real hunt for the leaders began. 10 days after the infamous shootout, the RUOP decided to strike a blow against the Koptovskaya gang. A large-scale operation was organized with the participation of special forces, and as a result, 7 leaders of the organized crime group were detained. However, despite the loud headlines in closed reports and the optimism of the leadership, the arrest turned out to be a failure. A thorough investigation failed to find evidence of their involvement in the shooting at the bathhouse. All the evidence was either circumstantial or completely absent. There were no weapons, no fingerprints, and no witnesses willing to testify. The lawyers played their part flawlessly, and in the end, all the gang leaders had to be released. It was a real fiasco, a painful blow to the reputation of law enforcement. The Koptevsky gang took it as a signal of impunity. The next wave of gang members was quickly arrested in May 1994. This time, the RUOP organized a raid on Atelier Sapphire, which, according to intelligence, was one of the Koptevsky gang's fronts. The operation was carefully planned, involving intelligence, surveillance, and arrest teams. When they stormed the premises, law enforcement officers discovered a veritable arsenal: automatic weapons, pistols, sawed-off shotguns, ammunition, walkie-talkies, and even bulletproof vests. At first glance, it seemed like a victory. But the operatives were once again set up. It turned out that all the weapons were officially registered to the Sapphire Atelier Security Service, which was registered in accordance with all the rules. And the security guards at the atelier were none other than the Koptevsky gang themselves. According to the documents, they were employees of a private security company with permits to store and carry weapons. It turned out that there were no grounds for initiating a criminal case. Nothing was illegal, everything was in order. The RUBOP officers were furious. They couldn't believe that people who had been holding machine guns and had blood on their hands yesterday were now protected by a piece of paper with an official seal. According to unofficial information, before releasing the gangsters, the operatives gave them an educational talk. They say they beat them for a long time, methodically and silently, for their wounded comrades and for the entire humiliated system. And then something strange began. Almost mystical. From that moment on, the Koptovskaya organized crime group began to literally crumble before our eyes. Its leaders began to die one after another, as if according to some list. Some disappeared without a trace, some were found dead in the woods, and some were shot in the back of the head right outside their own apartment building. What's more, all these murders were carried out so professionally that there were no traces, no witnesses, and no mistakes. The investigation was at a standstill. In a year and a half, 10 key figures of the Koptev group were eliminated. This was an unprecedented case in the history of Russian criminal warfare. Nothing like this had happened before or since. Law enforcement agencies officially stated that they had nothing to do with these murders. But criminal sources were convinced otherwise. The liquidation was carried out by people who had information, resources, training, and, most importantly, motivation. Everything pointed to the fact that this could have been an operation by law enforcement agencies that decided to act outside the law when it became clear that it was impossible to achieve justice within the system. It was impossible to think otherwise. Everyone who was even slightly familiar with the situation had no doubt that Rubop understood that official methods would not work against the Koptevskis. Legally, everything was ironclad, there was no evidence, they had the best lawyers, and their connections were at the highest level. But at the same time, the Rubop fighters had their own reasons. In the shootout at the bathhouse, several employees were seriously injured, and 2 were left disabled for life. They weren't just colleagues, they were friends, comrades who had stood shoulder to shoulder for years. And someone had to pay for that. The law was powerless, so justice would have to be served in their own way. The first to answer for everything was the Koptevsky authority Alexander Solovyov, better known in criminal circles by the nickname Solovey. On November 26th, he was in high spirits as he headed to the fashionable restaurant U Lukomoria, located in a picturesque area of the capital. There, delicacies were served, champagne flowed freely, and waiters addressed guests by their first and patronymic names. Solovey was satisfied with life. Money was flowing freely, business was growing, and enemies were retreating. He had just bought a brand new, expensive Porsche, freshly imported from Germany. But he was unable to enjoy his dinner. When Solovey left the restaurant, relaxed and smug, and walked to his car, 2 men approached him, masked, dressed in black, with silencers. 6 bullets, in the chest and head. Everything was done quickly, precisely, without fuss. Sniper work. He fell right onto the driver's seat. No one called an ambulance. Everyone understood. The police at the scene just shrugged their shoulders and, not wanting to stir up a hornet's nest, wrote off the incident as a showdown between organized crime groups. But that was only the beginning. The next targets were Naum himself, the leader of the Koptovskaya gang, Alexander Naumov, and his right-hand man, gang member Yuri Kuzmenkov, nicknamed Motya. These were serious figures. They were strategists who controlled dozens of businesses and dozens of militants and had iron discipline. On March 2nd, they were driving along Leningradskoy Shas in their new Audi 100, which had just been rolled out of the dealership. The car gleamed, smelled of fresh leather, and they had plans, an important meeting, some agreements, perhaps another deal. But fate had other ideas. At the 61st kilometer of the highway, they were suddenly cut off by an unremarkable Ziguli 4. It all looked like a random act of rudeness on the road. Firewood was hanging out of the trunk, a common rural scene. Naum and Motya, confident in themselves, thought that these were just another bunch of collective farmers who needed to be taught a lesson. But the collective farmers turned out to have Kalashnikov assault rifles. A barrage of fire was instantly opened from under the firewood. The rifles fired through the rear window directly into the Audi. Eyewitnesses later said that it was a real execution. Naum's car was riddled with bullets. He and Motya even managed to reach for their weapons, but that was all. They died instantly. The killers acted swiftly. They doused their 4 with gasoline, threw their assault rifles inside, set everything on fire, and fled. The car exploded a few minutes later. No traces, no fingerprints. According to the investigation, it looked like a classic showdown between organized crime groups, and the police began to spread the version that the attack was allegedly organized by the Solnechnogorsk group, with whom the Koptevsky Group had indeed had strained relations after one unsuccessful deal. After the daring elimination of the leaders of the Koptevsky gang, a chain reaction began that was impossible to stop. And although the destruction of the organized crime group leaders was carried out as professionally as possible and without leaving any traces, their associates were not going to sit idly by. The surviving gangsters, accustomed to living by the code, decided that Naum and Moti's deaths must be avenged. It didn't matter who was really behind these murders. If they couldn't get to the real enemy, everyone involved in any way would suffer. And so the Koptevskys, in the best traditions of the criminal lawlessness of the 1990s, decided to stage an act of intimidation. On June 4th, they arrived in Solnechnogorsk with a bang, at an evening disco at the local Lepsy House of Culture. This place was not chosen by chance. It was considered the unofficial hangout of the Solnechnogorsk organized crime group. Militants and local authorities gathered there, and their own party was in full swing. The Koptevsky gang stormed in like they were going to war, with machine guns, pistols, and a determination to take revenge. A fierce shootout began right in the middle of the dance hall, amid the roar of music and the screams of young men and women. It was like a scene from a gangster movie, only it was real. As a result of the attack, 10 people suffered gunshot wounds, 5 of them fatal. Several bodies lay right at the entrance to the cultural center, and 2 more bled to death in the corridor. The walls were splattered with blood, and the floor was littered with shell casings. This was not just an assassination attempt or a targeted elimination, it was a massacre. But, as it soon turned out, the Koptevsky gang had targeted the wrong people. Rumors about the Solnechnogorsk gang's involvement in Naum's murder turned out to be misinformation, carefully planted by a third party. Thus, the Koptevsky gang carried out a bloody vendetta, essentially at the wrong address. Law enforcement agencies cautiously commented on the incident as an internal showdown. Shortly thereafter, another mysterious loss occurred in the Koptevskaya group. One of the respected leaders, nicknamed Keliast, was found dead. As always, the official version of the law enforcement agencies seemed strange. Allegedly, Keliast had betrayed his own, taken a large sum from the common fund, and tried to escape, but he was found and punished by his own people. However, most of his fellow gang members did not believe this. Keliast was a trusted, reliable man, and moreover, he had no need to betray anyone. A more realistic version was that this was another wet job organized by the same invisible hands that had taken out Naum and the others. Realizing that it was a matter of weeks, if not days, Naum's younger brother, Vasily, also known as Naum Jr., decided not to tempt fate. Unlike many others, he had common sense and an analytical mind. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he realized in time that he would be the next target. Vasily urgently left the country, hiding abroad, presumably via Belarus or Ukraine. The Koptevskaya brigade was left without a direct heir, and in the resulting power vacuum, the helm was taken by former athlete and boxer Sergei Zimin, known by the nickname Zoma. He was charismatic, physically strong, and respected among the fighters, but unlike Naumov, he had neither political clout nor the necessary connections. Meanwhile, the machine of retribution continued its work. On August 4, 1995, another high-profile murder took place on Korovinsky Highway. 2 key members of the Koptevskaya organized crime group, Andrei Cheber, known by the nickname Starshaw, and Mikhail Kiryanov, were shot dead with automatic weapons from a passing Ziguli 4. These 2 were responsible for supplying the gang with weapons and ammunition. In essence, they were in charge of all the group's combat logistics. The attack was swift and precise. They were shot while moving, with no chance to take cover or respond. After another tense week, the Koptevskaya gang suffered new heavy losses. 2 respected figures were shot dead in Moscow, Kuznetsov and a certain Dage Bula, one of the gang's shadow accountants, who managed important financial flows through commercial structures in Lobnya and Mitishi. They were shot in the evening in a parking lot near a restaurant in Khimki. The attackers arrived in a minibus, opened heavy fire with automatic weapons, and disappeared in literally a minute and a half. Everything was done so cleanly and professionally that even the surveillance cameras on the facade did not have time to properly capture the vehicle's license plate number. Another signal: they are not just cleaning up the shooters, but those who held the money, connections, and coordinated the group's finances. Less than a month later, another shot shook the criminal world of the capital. Sergei Morozov, known in criminal circles as Moros, was found dead in the elevator of an apartment building in the Koptivo district. His activities were particularly sensitive. He maintained contacts with combat associations that included veterans of the Afghan War and Chernobyl disaster liquidators, men with combat experience, connections, and, for the most part, an irreconcilable attitude toward the authorities. Moros maintained strong ties with them, using them for security, showdowns, and even for transporting weapons. His elimination was not just another death, it was a blow to the supporting infrastructure of the entire group. Thus, in just a year and a half, 10 key figures of the Koptovskaya organized crime group were wiped off the face of the earth. This was an unprecedented event even for the bloody 1990s. Such a massive and systematic elimination of the gang's leadership happened for the first time and sent a signal. Whoever was behind these operations was powerful, well-informed, and completely unafraid of the consequences. The criminal world was seriously shaken. No one felt safe, because the leaders were being killed not at meetings or in bathhouses, but in elevators, on the streets, in cars, and at the doors of their own apartments. Basic security measures were no longer effective. Meanwhile, while abroad, Naum's younger brother, Vasily Naumov, or as he was called, Naum Jr., tried to salvage what remained of the destroyed criminal empire. He was practically glued to his phone, contacting influential figures in law enforcement on a daily basis, seeking out his former connections, officials, security forces, and old acquaintances in the FSB. Rumor has it that he even tried to reach out to people in the presidential administration through third parties. All this was to stop the purge, as he called it. But to no avail. His calls to the RUOP and the FSB went unanswered, his requests unheeded. Naum Jr.'s entourage increasingly whispered among themselves, "He's next." At the same time, a rumor spread throughout Moscow and the Moscow region. The Kurgan gangsters, known for their cruelty and strict hierarchy, were allegedly behind the purge of the Koptevsky gang. But this version did not stand up to scrutiny. The Kurgan gang regularly participated in joint meetings with the Koptevsky gang, vacationed with them abroad, collaborated on joint commercial projects, and their leaders had been considered personal friends of Naum since the early 1990s. No one believed that the Kurgan gang would so cold-bloodedly destroy their longtime allies. The version looked like an artificially thrown smokescreen. However, no matter how prudent Naum Jr. was, his fate was sealed. In 1997, his elimination put an end to the history of the Koptovskaya organized crime group's leadership. The elimination of Vasily Naumov deserves special attention. It was the culmination of the entire cleanup. After the high-profile murders of his associates, Vasily left Moscow and settled in one of the European countries, presumably Austria or Italy. But despite his escape, he continued to keep his finger on the pulse. He came to Russia every 2 to 3 months to personally collect money from income-generating assets and resolve any business issues that arose. Unlike other authorities, Vasily did not trust ordinary security guards. He relied on professionals and hired fighters from the elite police special forces unit, Saturn, as his bodyguards. Koptevsky leader Vasily Naumov, also known as Naum Jr., hoped until the very end that his connection to the system would save him from the fate that befell other authorities. He was convinced that if he surrounded himself with guards from the elite Interior Ministry Special Forces Unit Saturn, no one would dare to lay a hand on him. He expected that potential assassins would simply not dare to attempt an assassination in the presence of law enforcement officers. The risk of harming someone in uniform was too high. But this logic did not work. Moreover, it only provoked those who, from the very beginning, seemed to be acting without regard for formalities and status. On January 23, 1997, everything changed. In front of his own security guards from the Interior Ministry Special Forces, literally 200 meters from the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department building at 38 Petrovka Street, Naumov was cold-bloodedly shot by unknown assailants. This place was a symbol of state power, its immutability and order. And it was here, under its windows, that the sentence was carried out on the criminal boss, making the liquidation not just daring, but an open challenge. The execution scenario was planned down to the smallest detail. Naumov was getting out of his car, accompanied by 2 bodyguards, when a black foreign car with tinted windows pulled up sharply to the sidewalk. The doors flew open, and 3 men in black clothing, their faces hidden by balaclavas, jumped out of the car. They opened fire with automatic weapons in short, measured bursts. The bullets hit their target with sniper precision, Vasily's body. Within seconds, it was all over. The attackers silently returned to the car and fled the scene of the crime. The most striking thing was that Naumov's security detail was completely unharmed. None of the Special Forces soldiers, trained to respond to threats, were injured, did not return fire, and made no attempt to intercept the attackers. This sparked a lot of rumors. In criminal circles and among former law enforcement officers, there was talk that the operation was so flawless that the perpetrators were most likely not ordinary mercenaries, but highly skilled officers from Special Forces. Perhaps the perpetrators were fighters with access to operations of special importance, people with impeccable training who had experience in eliminating terrorists and traitors to the motherland. Even more disturbing was the symbolism of the murder site. Petrovka, 38, the heart of Moscow's criminal intelligence. It seems that the killers wanted not only to eliminate a criminal authority, but also to demonstrate to everyone that no one is untouchable, no place is sacred, and no one is immune. It was a powerful signal. The purge continues and will be completed. After the death of Naum Jr., the Koptovskaya organized crime group was effectively decapitated. A power struggle began within the structure. Various figures attempted to seize control, some from the old guard, some from the younger generation. But no one was able to fully replace Naumov. Some rose too quickly and died just as quickly. Others, sensing blood in the water, preferred to hastily leave the country. Within a couple of years, the structure that once held the north of Moscow and half of the Moscow region in fear fell apart, losing its discipline, influence, and connections. The Koptovskaya gang, once considered one of the most daring, independent, and bloody organized crime groups in the capital, effectively ceased to exist. All that remained were the pitiful remnants of its former power, a few small groups trying to preserve the brand, and the legends that still surround its history. A history full of blood, betrayal, power, and a sudden, rapid decline.